Okay, Saturn is a planet that is known as a malefic, so more challenging, like Mars. But for me, Saturn has been amazing in my life. And that is because I'm prepared to do the work. If I wasn't prepared to do the work, I probably wouldn't really like Saturn. And many of us have a bit of a negative vibe about Saturn. And we certainly know that when Saturn transits are happening in our life or Saturn stuff is going on, it usually brings with it a level of challenge. That is the truth. But challenge is not always a bad thing. And that's why I really want to look at the keywords and the energy of Saturn, but I want to bear that in mind. Just like Jupiter, our friend from last month, with all his joy and luck and benevolence, he can get sometimes a little bit much. We think of him as the greater benefic and Saturn as the greater malefic, but actually too much of a good thing is not always a good thing. And putting in the hard graft, Saturn, is sometimes the right thing to do. So when we couldn't see beyond our naked eye, Saturn was the furthest out planet. So in traditional astrology, we have the 7 planets, and we include Sun and Moon in that, stopping at Saturn. So Saturn, from a rulership perspective, has 2 signs. And I would actually really like to explain to you, when I put my chart up in the next video, I'm going to give you this little glimpse of a story that helps us to remember rulership, because now we're coming to the completion of all the traditional planets as we cover Saturn now. So Saturn was the furthest out one. So one thing he did do for Jupiter is he was a boundary, because Jupiter, even as big as he was, and think of Saturn's rings. I like to think of the rings of Saturn as a reminder that Saturn is the planet of boundaries. So here Jupiter is miles bigger than Saturn, but he really can't get his energy out past Saturn. It has to be contained inside of Saturn's orbit, really. Versus when we go next week to Uranus and even further to Neptune, and then, of course, Pluto, who we've already covered, those are outside of the boundaries of Saturn. They are transpersonal. They are beyond what we can see. And we sort of started to feel this with our study on Pluto. They have a very different vibe. So even though Jupiter and Saturn are not personal planets, and we've talked about the personal planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, 5 personal planets that link us to our personality, different aspects of our personality. Jupiter and Saturn are not transpersonal, too far out, and they're not personal. They are often called the gas giants, and I like to think of them as the grandfather energies. And one of the ways I like to kind of understand and embody this for myself is imagining having 2 grandfathers. And one, Jupiter, is just so much fun. He always has sweets for you. He's always good for a laugh and a tickle. And he doesn't mind if you skip eating your veggies and just jump to dessert. He's just so much fun. And he's the grandparent that when your parents say you're going to go visit Grandpa Jupiter, everyone's like, yeah, he's the best grandpa ever. Then you have Saturn. And when you hear you're going to Grandpa Saturn, you're like, oh, God, we're going to have to do chores. He's a farmer. I like to think of Saturn as a farmer, a grandfather who's a farmer. And he's up early and he expects you to be too. And he goes to bed at a reasonable hour because he knows he's going to be up early. And he expects you to eat your vegetables and eat well, because there's not going to be snacks until the next meal, because we're going out on the land and we're going to work hard and we're going to get hungry, and if you don't eat now, you'll find the consequences of your actions. So Grandpa Saturn, he teaches hard work, he teaches mastering your craft, he teaches resilience and effort, and he really likes time put in over effort put in over time. So he doesn't really want you to say, I'm going to crash study this thing, do a crash course because I've got an exam on Monday and it's now Saturday evening. He says, do the work through the term, study for the tests, the tests during the term, look back over what you didn't understand. By the time you get to the exam, you've been putting in the effort, you've been putting in the work, and then you will reap the rewards, then you will harvest. So do remember, he does link to farming. Remember the golden age and how he did teach us that. And the scathe can be seen as, like that death carries a scathe, but it can also be seen as harvesting, cutting back, recognizing where are the boundaries, when has this plant grown beyond what is healthy for it, when do I have to know to cut something back, when do I have to know to feed the soil. And that only comes from getting out on the land every day doing the work. So whatever Saturn is teaching you in your own chart, he wants you to develop mastery in that area of your life, in that archetype, whatever it is. Like I have a Virgo Saturn, and I'm going to look at mine just now when we open the chart. He really is pushing you. So one day when you're an adult, you may look back at your childhood and you might remember with a big smile on your dial how much fun Grandpa Jupiter was. But you will really learn over time, maybe not as a child, to value the lessons learned with Grandpa Saturn, because Grandfather Saturn taught you life skills. He taught you work ethic. He taught you to care enough to put in the work. Saturn has a very strong karmic role in our astrology. So wherever Saturn is saying this is where you wanted to put in some karma, to work on your karma, to develop something over time. The other really important thing, and I'm going to show this to you a little bit better when I open up my chart, is a Saturn cycle. A Saturn cycle is 28 to 29 and a half years. You may notice where a moon cycle is 28 to 29 and a half days, a Saturn cycle is 28 to 29 and a half years. There is a very strong interconnection with moon and Saturn. Obviously, the moon working in short, sharp bursts by comparison to Saturn. And we're not going to get into this, but just to give you an understanding, there is such a thing as a progressed chart, which is looking at a much slower version of a chart. And if you slow your chart down to a progressed chart, then the moon cycle becomes the same length as a Saturn cycle. Your Saturn cycle in the progressed chart gets much, much longer. But in the progressed chart, the moon cycle is as long as a normal Saturn cycle. So there's a lot to be learned in that, and understanding our moon phases and how we go from new moon, 7 days to the first quarter, another 7 days. So 14 days from new moon to full moon, and 7 days, and 7 days to last quarter. So we work in sevens, 7, 14, 21, 28. New moon, first quarter moon, full moon, last quarter moon, next new moon. And so we go. With Saturn, it's the same, but we go in years. So when you understand a moon cycle, when you've worked through a moon cycle, and this is what I love also, that working with the moon for years, as all of you have been doing to some degree or another, certainly if you've been in Red 10 for a while, you're going to start to realize that understanding that the moon is about embodying. So we have been embodying in the micro what Saturn is giving us in the macro. So if we knew Saturn, where Saturn was when you were born, 7 years later, Saturn is at his first quarter of his phase. And 14 years later, he's here. And 21 years later, and then we have a Saturn return at between 28 and 30. Let's just call it between 28 and 30, we have a Saturn return. And those hard angles of the Saturn, the squares and the opposition and the conjunction, those are where the big, juicy karmic work tends to happen. It's often not comfortable. It's often something gritty, like if we come back to the sort of farm analogy, and he did a bit of carpentry to fix something, the barn door, and it keeps grinding because it hasn't been done properly. He's got to come there and fix. I'm not a carpenter, so this might be a terrible analogy, but it's the one that Saturn is sending me in the minute. So he's got to do this work to fix the grind. And that's what happens around these quarter points. One of the things I love to do in astrology readings is to focus on the Saturn cycle. And then we go, okay, let's focus on what the theme was around 7, around 14, around 21, around 28, and then let's go around again. If you've had more than one Saturn cycle, we go, okay, so what did 35 and 7 have in common? Because this point is going to have a similar theme. Obviously, you're almost 30 years older than you were the first time you did this point, or this point, or this point, or this point. So there's been a level of developing your mastery. And that's where we really start to value time and effort put in over time. Okay, I won't get too long-winded. We're going to look, oh, wait. Actually, before we do that, I am going to do a little share screen to show you here. Okay, so my Saturn story, we're going to do our Saturn sign. So, for example, I'd say my Saturn sign is in Virgo. My Saturn is in the first house. What planets is it aspecting? Mine has a tight square with Venus. I'm not going to do my whole thing here, just giving you an example. Saturn rules which houses. So we're going to look. Saturn rules the sign, and it's a reminder down here, planets in Capricorn and Aquarius. So Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius. So which houses are Capricorn and Aquarius starting? Because that's what Saturn is ruling. So in my house, Saturn, hang on, let me just see my chart in my mind's eye. Okay, now I'm going to show you that when we do my chart in a minute. And then I came here to master. Because Saturn is about mastery, think about where it is in your life. So mine is in the first house and what sign it's in. So I came here to master myself and how I can be, Virgo, mine's in Virgo, can be a vessel of service by first tending to myself, doing my work, tending to my needs so that I can be a greater vessel of service for others. That's maybe one way how I would write that story. Then here's the page for Saturn. And so Saturn keywords, I contract, I master, I am disciplined. I said I contract because I was thinking of writing a contract, but it's I contract. Where Jupiter is, I expand. Saturn, in many ways, has opposing energy to Jupiter. Not entirely, but in a lot of ways. So we could say I expand for Jupiter, I contract for Saturn. And then he's also, I master, I am disciplined, firm but fair, restrained, frugal, hardworking, and practical. He has a very down-to-earth vibe, especially in Capricorn. Okay, so here's an example of how he has quite a different vibe in Capricorn and in Aquarius. And the modern ruler, or the co-ruler, let's call it, of Aquarius, once discovered was Uranus, which is why we're going to cover that next month in Aquarius, new moon. But so he's the only ruler that we look to of Capricorn. But he kind of shares with Uranus, and Saturn and Uranus are very different energies astrologically. So therefore, it's like, how can we associate these two very different energies with the same archetypal sign? And yet, I feel like it really works. I think in many ways, for me, Aquarius's more obvious energy is Uranus. But actually, Aquarius is the older air sign. It's the third of the air signs. And it has a deep sense of duty and responsibility to the collective. And even though it's not always the practical doing of the thing, like Capricorn, the discipline to the vision is there. And they can be, it's a fixed air sign, fixed, naturally boundaried. Air in itself is not thought of to be stuck. But of all of the air, Aquarius is the only fixed air. And if you know an Aquarian, you know that once they hit a wall, it's not that easy to get them to move beyond what their idea is. They're fixed, they're stubborn, they have stronger boundaries than Gemini or Libra. Although Saturn does love being in Libra, which you can see down here. Sorry, I'm jumping, but Saturn loves Libra. And I think that's because Saturn loves justice and order. And as I said, they're firm but fair. He has strong boundaries, but he wants things to be fair. Therefore, Libra, the scales of justice, it's really a good sign for him. He doesn't like Aries because Aries is the exact opposite. Aries is hot-headed. Aries is too fast, too passionate, too much. Aries is too much for Saturn. I can't say that in general because I do have that Aries moon. Okay, so Capricorn works to build on a practical level versus Aquarius works to build on an ideal for the whole. Capricorn tends to be more tradition, whereas Aquarius is more vision. Capricorn tends to work where your feet are, like the farmer, whereas Aquarius is more shoot for the stars. Aquarius is actually a sign that links to astrology and astronomy and that sort of thing. There was something I was about to tell you about these guys. Now it's slipped my mind. Anyway, it'll come back or it won't. So debilitated in Cancer and Leo. Those are the two signs that Saturn doesn't really like being in. The one ruled by the moon and the one ruled by the sun. And I want to put a pin in that because that's where I want to come back to in the next video. So let's jump into that one.